Hello, glad you're back with us, and we're studying Daniel. We're in chapter 2 now. We talked about chapter 1, and we've already introduced the book, so we're ready for chapter 2. I'm going to try to move through the bulk of this early material rather quickly, and we'll try to get into the prophetic section where Daniel starts to interpret this vision. Let's go ahead and move into this. This is Daniel 2:1. It says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. I established that a little bit in our last segment. That's probably around 603, I'm thinking. Could be even 602. Second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled. His sleep left him. Verse 2 says, the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. Interestingly enough, for some reason, Daniel is absent. Don't know why that is. But nonetheless, he's not there. You would have thought he may have been, seeing that in chapter 1 he had already proven himself extremely good. In chapter 1, 18, 19, 20, the king even consulted him there. But then again, maybe he still looks at Daniel as something of a novice, and he's not experienced. He is a young man, and so he calls in the experts to work with this dream that he had had. So Daniel's not there. Then we talked a little bit last time about the word Chaldeans and how that gets used by the skeptics to try to make an argument about how this is all by some late author. I don't know that that's quite true. Verse 3, the king came and said to them, I had a dream. My spirit is anxious to understand the dream. And then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And the book at this point, which had been up to this point in Hebrew, switches to Aramaic. I'm not 100% sure why that is. But from 2:4 up through 6:28, we've got the text is in Aramaic. That runs from Daniel chapter 2 verse 4 through 6:28, and then in chapter 7 and verse 1, it looks like we're back into or rather in 8:1, we're back into the Hebrew text. In 7:28, it ends the Aramaic section. So let me make that correction again. It's in 7:28 that the text ends in Aramaic, and it switches back to Hebrew in 8:1. From 2:4 to 7:28, 2:4 to 7:28, the text is in Aramaic. Not sure why that is, but that it is, we're sure of that. Okay, verse 4 then. So it says in Aramaic, the Chaldeans spoke in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. That's what they're saying. So in verse 5, the king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream, verse 6, and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation. Verse 7 says, they answered a second time and said, well then let the king tell the dream to his servants, and we'll declare the interpretation. But the king replied, verse 8, I know for certain that you're bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. And he says in verse 9, this is an interesting line, you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation. Well, you can imagine their response. He says, you've prepared lying and corrupt words. You can't even work out the dream, let alone give me a good interpretation. See, he's not trusting these fellows for some reason. He says, if you're really as skilled as you let on, why can't you just go ahead and tell me even what my dream was? But they don't have that sort of knowledge. So in 2:10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. But, verse 11, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there's no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Well, they're right about one thing. A man of his own ability? No, he couldn't do that sort of thing. But they've misunderstood that Daniel is a fellow who has God on his side, and this God is a supernatural being who can intervene and step into what naturalists might think would be a closed system. The laws of nature don't restrict the God of heaven who gave them. And so in 2:12, it says, because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. His conclusion is, no wise men would be better than lying wise men. Well, I suppose that's probably true, in the sense that a liar who might even have wisdom about him, if he has some kind of insight or intuition, even if he's a liar, it's not going to do us any good, is it? So in verse 13, the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. And so it says that they should destroy all the wise men of Babylon, 2:12. I wonder if that may just refer to the province and not the entire empire. That's probably the case. I think at 249 says something like this. Daniel made request of the king. He appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon. Same kind of thing in 3:1. It says he set up this statue in 3:1, this golden statue, in the province of Babylon. Maybe he was seeking to kill all of the wise men in the province rather than the entire empire. But in verse 14, Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. This is an executioner. The word also could mean executioner. The word translated bodyguard could be executioner. And so in verse 15, he said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" And Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. And it says this in verse 16, Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Now, catch this. Daniel knows his life's on the line. What does he do? I'll tell you sometimes what I'd be tempted to do. Your livelihood's at stake. You might think about your bank account, might think about your personal security, maybe check your firearms. You might even make sure your doors are locked. Well, I suppose all of that's fine. But where's our first place we turn? He says in 2:17, Daniel went to his house. He informed the friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter. And in verse 18, it lets us know why. So that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. These fellows know how to pray. These fellows know where their priorities are. These fellows know where to turn in a moment of crisis. And the same thing ought to be said of you and me. So he says in 2:19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel. I wonder why that was. Well, it was probably because of his faithfulness. Wonder why it was revealed to Daniel. Probably because he requested it from God. Probably because he knew that the Lord could deliver. It was a prayer of faith. James says something like that, don't you think? James 1:5 and 6. Let the prayer of faith, the prayer for wisdom, be of faith, nothing wavering. The man that wavers is like a wave of the sea tossed to and fro. Yes, I think this was the prayer of faith. So it says the mystery was revealed. In the Greek, you've got this Greek Old Testament. It's called the Septuagint. It's a translation of the Hebrew, and it has its strengths and it has its weaknesses, as you can imagine. Well, one of the strengths of the Greek Old Testament is that the Greek New Testament often draws on it. And so sometimes we can compare that syntax from the Greek New Testament, and where it matches up precisely with the Greek Old Testament, it surely appears that the New Testament is explicitly echoing or alluding to that specific text. Here's one of those instances. It says that the mystery was revealed to Daniel. Revelation 10:7 uses the same line. In Revelation 10:7, you have the same line in the Greek New Testament as in the Greek Old Testament here. And so in Revelation 10:7, if you're familiar with Revelation, you'll get the point maybe faster than some. But if you haven't spent time in Revelation, you might want to check my commentary out on that as well, Exposition of Revelation. You can find it at the same place. You can find the Daniel book, lulu.com, or on my website, cadleonard.com. But in Revelation 10:7, it says this, in the days of the voice of the seventh angel, when he is about to sound, then the mystery of God is finished, as he preached to his servants the prophets. You want to know what Revelation concerns itself with? Well, keep in mind this. It tells us over and over again, the book does, that the events of Revelation were at hand. John is writing this, tough to say exactly when. Maybe it looks like to me during Vespasian's reign, somewhere around 69 to 79. But John, this human author who's writing the book, of course, by inspiration, is looking forward to this upcoming crisis. And as he looks forward to it, he says it's speaking about Rome. That's what the text is about. Chapters 17 and 18 of Revelation establish this clearly. Anybody who thinks otherwise is just naive. John says in 1:1 and 1:3, he says that the book was shortly to come to pass. It was at hand. He gives us an envelope around the entire content of the book, and says again in chapter 22:6 and 22:10 that the book was at hand. It was to be soon to come to pass, shortly to come to pass. John creates here an envelope around the entire book of Revelation. It's called an inclusio argument. It's an enveloping or a bracketing of the entire book, and it says that the whole thing is at hand, shortly to come to pass, soon. Christ is coming quickly, and he's going to quickly come and bomb Rome right out of existence. Here's the point. John is dealing with Rome. Let's get this again. In John's dealing with the book of Revelation, John looks forward to a time of the Roman fall. Now, in chapter 10, verse 7 of Revelation, we have the same precise Greek syntax. Precisely the same Greek syntax here as found in Daniel chapter 2 and verse 19, the revealed mystery. And he's dealing with the Roman threat. What do you think Daniel's dealing with? Daniel's looking forward as well, and he's seeing the same thing. He's looking at the Roman threat. And that's why Daniel chapter 2 and verse 19 is picked up. The LXX of 2:19, the Greek Old Testament, is picked up by John in Revelation 10:7 in the Greek New Testament. And the reason he does that is to say, look at the end of 10:7 again of Revelation, it was just as it was spoken by the prophets. Daniel is exceptional among the prophets. He is highly predictive. He's got names and dates all over. And we're in a context where there is a mystery. The Greek word is mysterion. It's in both texts. And his mystery has to do with these 1, 2, 3, 4 bestial, and here I'm having an issue spelling, empires. He's dealing with the empires. If we're right to identify the fourth one as Rome, Daniel and John are talking about the same thing. And we'll establish that view as we go on, not just in chapter 2, but especially as we get into 7, 8, 9, and then 10 through 12. So we've got John and Daniel dealing with the same thing. It's not accidental that John, the writer of Revelation, picks up the same syntax from Daniel to basically call attention to the fact that Rome is destined for destruction. Rome is not God's kingdom. They're destined to fail. So in 2:19, let's get back to Daniel 2:19. The mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, and he praises God and says, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever. Wisdom and power belong to him. He is the one who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. He is the one who reveals the profound and the hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. You have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." Daniel is insisting on one of those themes that we insisted upon in the first lesson. In the introduction, one of the themes is God still deals in the affairs of men. That is precisely what Daniel is saying. God is responsible. He removes kings and sets them up. He does the same thing with presidents, folks. He does the same thing today with nations. If we don't believe that God's still involved in human affairs, then give up on prayer. But that's not what we're to do. Keep praying. God still works, and he works in ways that we perhaps don't even understand or comprehend, but that he does work, we're sure. We may not be able to know the mechanics or the details of how he does it, but that he does, we're sure. And so in 2:24, Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men. This is the man who's got his head just about to be on a platter. And he went and spoke to him as follows. "Do not destroy," Daniel says to Arioch. "Do not destroy," verse 24, "the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king." Verse 25 says, Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows. "I've found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king." This would save a number of lives, wouldn't it? And so in 26, the king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, that's going to be said even in the later part of the book, says something about the unity of the text. One author here. It says in verse 26, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" See, he's not just concerned, Nebuchadnezzar isn't, he's not only concerned with the interpretation. Anybody could fake an interpretation. He wants to know, can you tell me the dream? And this is going to vindicate Daniel and say that he really is God's man. This is verse 27. Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, diviners, none of these fellows are able to declare it to the king. He makes it very clear. You've given your people a chance at this, and they've failed. They've not succeeded. And so in Daniel chapter 2, it says this in verse 28, however, there is a king in heaven who reveals mysteries. He's made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the last or latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. Okay, let's work with that phrase for just a brief moment. The latter days or the last days. Let me throw this up and see if we can't work with this for just a moment. Last days. Last or latter days. Let's see if we can come up with a couple of possibilities as to what that means. Let's start with the worst and work our way forward. The first is to take a premillennial viewpoint, and to say that the last days involves the signs of the times allegedly that are supposed to point right at the second coming of Christ. This is going to, the last days will then initiate the rapture. All of the saved will be taken out of this world. There's a lot of detail that, depending on who you talk to, this view would kind of shift a little bit, but this is the general structure of it. The rapture would commence after the signs of the times have built up to their climax. And after the rapture, then, you'll have 7 years of tribulation right after the rapture. 7 years of tribulation. This is all horribly read out of Daniel and Revelation, just simply not even in the text, but it's drawn up by this view. 7 years of tribulation. And then Christ is going to come back to earth. He's going to have the battle of Armageddon. He'll reign on planet earth for 1,000 literal years, and then we're all going back to heaven. So, number of problems with the view. The biggest problem here, and I just don't have time to get into this isn't the concern of our study, but this is just not even in the text. Do you understand? The signs of the times as we're taught, the rapture, a 7-year tribulation, 1,000-year literal reign, all of this is extremely questionable, and that's just giving it nicely. This is an extremely questionable view. It's not even supported closely by the text. The passages that are used to bolster the theory just simply aren't being treated fairly by the people who support it. Let's go with a second option. A second possibility is that it refers to the Christian age. Not too bad. We need to give some definition to that. The prophets, like Isaiah 2, Micah 4, they're not predicting in the same way that Daniel is. Let me try to embellish that. They didn't know the details. They didn't have names and dates all over their texts like Daniel does. Daniel basically pre-writes history in his case. But in like Isaiah 2 or Micah 4, their prophetic discourse about future things is more imaginative or ideal. So, yes, they're talking like in Isaiah 2 or Micah 4, they are talking about the Messiah. But they're not giving us names and dates like Daniel does. They're not that specific. So they paint for us ideal scenes, where it would be ideal in this kind of thing, and they're imagining the era of the Messiah. They don't give us the names and dates like Daniel does. And this Christian, Christ is the same word. Christ is the Greek word, Christos, for Hebrew, Messiah. So this is Greek. This is Hebrew. So we mean the same thing. If we were to talk about the Christian age or the Messianic age, it's the same thing. It's just a different language. Greek is Christian. Hebrew is Messiah. Those are two different words. Christos, Messiah. And we mean the same thing by both of them now in the 21st century. The Jews are still looking forward to this Messianic age. The Jews who don't think Jesus was the Messiah, they're still awaiting the Messianic age to come. Now, Those of us that call ourselves Christians, we claim to be Christians, believe that Christ has come. The Messiah, the Hebrew Messiah, has come. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. And we believe that he did come. So there is an approach that says the Christian age or the Messianic age. Maybe that's right here in Daniel 2. Tough to say. I don't really think it is. But then there's a third thing that's really close here. If we understand that the Christian age is simply another way of saying the Messianic age, then the Jews may think of last days, this phrase last days, as something like last days of the Jewish nation. That's different. We're talking about the Jewish nation then, rather than some kind of development of church and Lord's Suppers and a cappella singing and that sort of thing. They're thinking of something like, this is the last day of our people. And let me say this while I'm on it. The Old Testament knows nothing of a second coming of Christ. The Old Testament and its theology knows nothing of a second coming of Christ. It always speaks to us about the first. There's not a singular text in the Old Testament that speaks about the second coming of Christ. The Old Testament people weren't even close to comprehending such a point. They only were expecting the coming of the Messiah, at which they thought that would be the last days of their nation as well. That's when the Jews would be back on top. They would dominate the world order, and they imagined a new temple being built. All of this predicted, or prophesied rather, by people like Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel. They were expecting a last days of the Jewish nation to be one and the same with the final coming of Christ. They didn't know about a second coming. They only thought there'd be one. So, the last days of the Jewish nation are discussed in a couple of places, like in Daniel 10:14. Maybe that's a possibility here as well. And then there's a fourth possibility, and that is that it just means a later time. Here, I think that's best. Here, that it just means a later time. So look at the text again. This is Daniel chapter 2 and verse 28. Daniel says, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in a later time. That's probably right. Just a later time. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. Now, I just gave you 4 possibilities as to what it could mean. I think the first possibility, the premillennial view, isn't a possibility at all, you'll see. But I think these other 3 are possibilities if correctly understood, and it's going to vary which context is in view. I think you need to look at Isaiah 2. I think you need to look at Daniel 10 and verse 14. There's a number of places where this kind of phraseology is used, and it's going to vary based on the context. Here, I think it just means later time. Premillennial notion is just simply not supported here. You've got to see it's just not supported here. This is 2:29. As for you, Daniel 2:29, O king, while on your bed your thoughts turn to what would take place in the future, and he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place at a later time. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me, more than in any other living man. Daniel's basically saying, I'm inadequate. As a human being, I'm inadequate. But for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind, he's saying, God has given me this power. For some reason, God is expecting Daniel to intervene here. And this is in 2:31. Why do you think Daniel was selected by God to do things like this? Because Daniel's message doesn't just exist between him and Nebuchadnezzar. It exists even for the people of Daniel's own day who are going to later read his text and recognize other empires are coming before the Messiah comes. It's given for people like you and me who are reading this far later to recognize that Daniel was a fellow, and it shows what God does in the affairs of men then and still does now. This is 2:31. Daniel was selected for a marvelous task. This is 2:31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. He's telling the dream. Nebuchadnezzar maybe knew what his dream was, but he was testing his men to see, could they tell him what the dream was? They could not. Daniel now tells him, by God's power, of course. This is 2:31. He tells him the dream and says, that statue which was large and of extraordinary splendor, it was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, the breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And it says this then in verse 34. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. And then in the dream, this is just the dream, Daniel's not interpreting yet. He says in 35, the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. We'll interpret it here when Daniel interprets it for us. We'll give a little more depth to that. But what we have is 4 different sections to this colossal image that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in his dream. The head of gold, the upper body of silver, the torso of brass or bronze, and then the base, the legs and the feet of iron, and then iron mixed with clay. Now, Daniel's going to interpret this here in just a moment, but even in the surface, just hearing of the dream, we can pick out a couple of things. First of all, it's interesting that this stone, verse 34, in Daniel 2:34, a stone that was cut without hands comes colliding into the image and crushes it. That's odd. That's odd. What is significant about a stone cut without hands? It suggests something about divine origin. Job chapter 34 and verse 20 uses the phrase some way like that. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 25 will later speak about this fellow, this villain, Antiochus Epiphanes, and it will say his death was made without hands. So the phrase indicates something of divine origin. The stone, then, that collides into these 4 sections of the image, the stone is something from God. God is the one doing something against the 4 sections of this image. And then in verse 35 we have this. I'm going to make a technical point here. This is in 2:35. It says that not a trace of them, the elements of the image, not a trace of them was found. You have the same kind of remark in Revelation 2:11. It is the exact same remark in Revelation 20, verse 11. Now again, like I said about the earlier point in Revelation 10:7, if you're not too familiar with the book of Revelation, you may not get this point as well, but let me try to go at it anyway and make a little bit of sense with it. This is Revelation 20 and verse 11. It says this is following the 1,000-year reign, and I think that's a figure. I think that's a figure. You'd need to see my commentary to get the fuller view. But this is 20 verse 11. I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. That phrase in 20:11 of Revelation, no place found for them, that we see in Revelation 20 verse 11 in the Greek New Testament, it seems very clear is a direct echo to Daniel 2:35. Now, this is a little bit technical. The LXX is what we basically refer to as the Greek Old Testament. The Greek Old Testament, we term it the Septuagint or the LXX, the 70. It was translated allegedly by the 70 translators or the people who worked on that text. And it was maybe done somewhere around, 280 BC, maybe a little later than that. But somewhere in the intertestamental period history between the Old and New Testaments. Now, Daniel 2:35 in the LXX won't have that phrase. But there was a translation that was arising at the same time, something like that, Greek. It was a Greek translation, and it's by this fellow named Theodotion. And this is the symbol that the scholars use. It's the Greek theta, and it's used to refer to Theodotion's text. So you have the MT, which is the Masoretic text. You've got the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Masoretic text. You've got Theodotion's materials, which came around somehow either by influence of the LXX or the Masoretic text or both. You've got other translations like the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've got the Greek New Testament, which is, of course, New Testament materials. You've got different texts in the original language, and all of those things would go back to the original. So, you would have texts like the Masoretic text that would have drawn on the original copies. So let's say Daniel is the original author. The Masoretic text would have copies made based on Daniel's original. Other copies arise. The LXX, was it based directly on Daniel's original text? Probably not. Probably drew on the Masoretic text more than likely. Well, how did Theodosian's material come about? It could be the case that it drew on the LXX. Could be the case that it drew on the Masoretic text. Just tough to say. What's my point? Revelation 20, verse 11, draws on Daniel 2:35 in Theodosian's material. The Greek New Testament uses Theodosian's material and uses that same phrase, no place was found for them. What's Daniel talking about? Four sections of the image. What do you think he's talking about in Daniel 2? The 4 sections. Let's see if you go for this. I think that the 4 sections of the image are Babylon, Media or Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And he says there was no place found for the colossal image, culminating in the Roman section. This is in Daniel 2. I think most of us would probably go for that. That when he says no place was found for them, the interpretation we're going to see revolves around the Roman kings. Let's get Revelation 20 now. What do you think Revelation 20 and verse 11 is doing? I think this. In Revelation 20, I think we've got a number of reasons, which I develop in my commentary on Revelation. I think we've got a number of reasons why John also in that section is dealing with Rome. There are too many reasons for me to just ignore and to think that John's not dealing with Rome, is dealing with the end of time. He says and he envelopes his entire book by saying the whole thing is at hand and shortly to come to pass. The whole way through, Revelation deals with this threat from the oppressor who is the emperor that embodies the Roman threat. Daniel deals with Rome. John also is dealing with Rome. And there are more arguments, stronger arguments than that one, why I think that on Revelation 20. The white throne judgment is a picture. The white throne judgment is a picture that John uses to discuss the judgment upon Rome. It's a highly idealized, stylistic, figurative image. He's not speaking literally about our future and our end of time. John has a number of reasons why he doesn't think that. John is using the same literature as the prophets to talk about the judgment in that day upon the oppressor who is Domitian, who embodies the Roman threat. John's text deals with Rome. Now, that is one question, and this deals with one thing. The first thing that talks about is fulfillment. So the fulfillment of Daniel 2, Revelation, is all about Rome. That's the point. Now, do not accuse me of saying then that I think that these texts are useless and they're out of date and there's just no purpose to them. More than one naive scholar has said something like that. That is bizarrely off. That is radically off. Fulfillment differs from, a second word is application. Application. How many of you think that Babylon has fallen? Oh, I do. I know we all think that. How many of you think then that all of these Old Testament texts that talk about Babylon, how many of you think that those are just useless to us now? You don't think that any more than I do you? In Romans 15:4 it says these things were written for our learning. There is a difference between fulfillment, whether it be in Babylon or Assyria or Egypt or whatever. There is a difference between the fulfillment in that nation and an application of that literature. The same truths that are expressed in a timeless way in the face of Rome or Babylon or Egypt, those same truths are equally as applicable today, but that hardly means that we're waiting for the prophetic corpus to be fulfilled. Daniel 2 is not still looking for a fulfillment, but to say that it doesn't apply would be an egregious error indeed. Okay, let's get back then into Daniel chapter 2 and verse 35. Not a trace of them was found. Same kind of remark that's made in Revelation 20 verse 11 in the Greek. And the point is being made that the Roman section in Revelation won't succeed. The image in Daniel 2 ending in the Roman section won't succeed. And we better yet have another thing that enters into the dream. It is this stone that was cut out without hands, and it is going to destroy the image, and it will be the one that continues on into the whole earth and becomes great like a great mountain. What's all this talking about? Let's get to 36. Now Daniel will interpret for us. He's going to tell us, he's first told us what the dream is. Now let's see if we can figure out what it means, what it applies to, what its fulfillment is. He says in 236, "This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of Kings." Paul will later draw on that remark. He'll call Christ Lord of Lords, King of Kings. 1 Timothy 6:15, even Revelation 19:11 through 16 pictures Christ coming in on the white horse in the vision, in the drama. And Christ is the one who's called Lord of Lords, King of Kings. This is 37. "Your King of Kings, O Lord, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all." Daniel's emphasizing that God is the one in charge. And he says in 238, "You, Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold." So let's see if we can map this out. The gold section is Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of Babylon. He's the king. He is the embodiment of that world power. Verse 39 says, "After you there will arise another kingdom inferior, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth." Verse 39 seems sufficient to me to make clear that we're dealing with kingdoms, empires, and not just kings. We can't say the gold is equivalent just to Nebuchadnezzar and try to make all of these individuals. It's representative. 39 is more or less saying that, of the entire nation. So we have a second kingdom. What was its element? That's right, if you look back earlier into, it was the silver. And it says in 239, it will be inferior to Babylon. It's speaking of the Medo-Persian Empire. Then you've got this third section, the bronze or the brass. And it says this of it, it's a third kingdom which will rule over all the earth. That's talking about Greece. And then it says in verse 40, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, and it will even crush and shatter all things, but like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these pieces in pieces. Okay, so we have a fourth, and it was iron and iron mixed with clay, and it represents, I'm very content to say, Rome. How many of you think you'll go for that? A number of you. That's good. That's good. Why do we think that it can't be that it's Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece? 4 reasons that we gave in the introduction. I'll just hit them very quickly again. The first one is, in the book of Daniel, Media and Persia are never treated as 2 and 3. They are always treated. Argument number 1 is they are always treated as a conjoined element and never a separate entity, where Media is one thing and Persia is another thing in the book of Daniel. The second thing is there is no room that exists here for an independent Median empire. Babylon ends in 539. Persia, Cyrus the Persian, picks up in 539. How do you get this whole independent Median empire there in the in-between? You do not. A third argument is that the 4, I'll not go through all these passages again, but the number 4 is always used, or I say always, a number of times used in reference to the 4 commanders that come up after Alexander. That's out of the Greek Empire, out of the Grecian Empire. But the third empire would be Persia, if we had the 4 as being Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, or rather, let me do this again. Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece. That would make the Persian Empire the third beast of Daniel 7:6. And 4 come up out of Persia? Not appropriate. That's not appropriate. In 7:6, it's speaking about the Grecian Empire, who has 4 come up out of it: Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. That's quick. I know that's quick. But then a fourth argument is the Messianic kingdom doesn't even come close to coming in the time of Greece. The Greeks stopped their reign more or less. It's just not even close. The Maccabean era, are we to say that the Maccabean era is the time where the Messianic kingdom comes about? Are we to say that Daniel got it wrong? Or better yet, let's do this. Look at this timeline. This is 6th century BC. Here is the cross. And let's say that we do give way to this liberal critical view of a 2nd century BC authorship. This would be about where the Maccabees revolted, Judas Maccabeus. And it's argued by the liberal critical scholars that this was the era in view where the kingdom's going to come about and everything. Why in the world would a writer here in the 2nd century write this kind of lofty expectation of the kingdom of God in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 12? Why would he write, looking back here just a few years before, why would he look back and then write such lofty literature about this stone that's made without hands that's going to come and crush the colossal images, all 4 sections? Anybody who knew secular history and knows secular history knows that this era didn't come close to amounting to the Messianic era. If you have a late author, he's not going to write this sort of thing that way. A conservative authorship of Daniel that looks forward and past Antiochus's day, past the Maccabean era to the cross, that makes sense. That makes a good lot of sense. So we won't go for the other view where it's ending the 4th beast of the 4th empire as Greece or Antiochus. It's got to go beyond that in order to make any kind of sense of the literature. Now, let's go back here and take a look at Daniel chapter 2 and verse 41. This 4th kingdom, it has feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom. It'll have the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. Now it says in 242, the toes of the feet were partly iron, partly pottery. Some of the kingdom will be strong, part of it will be brittle. And you saw the iron, verse 43, mixed with common clay. They will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they'll not adhere to one another, even as iron doesn't combine with pottery. You can look at Daniel 11:39 and following, or Revelation 17:12 through 18, and you can get an idea of Rome's inner strife. They were divided. The Senate was in disarray. They had a mess. And they sold out to these sub-state kings, civil state kings. It wasn't a good arrangement. And so while they were very strong, they also had a lot of inner division. And that's what it's talking about here, I'm certain. So in Daniel 2 and verse 44, in the days of those kings, the days of the Roman kings, you think that? I do too. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. The Messianic kingdom, the one that the Jews are expecting with a person back on David's throne, a person of David's lineage to be back on the throne. We talked about some of this in the introduction. That kingdom, the Messianic kingdom that all the Jews are awaiting, when are we going to be back on top? That kingdom, it says, will surface in the days of the 4th empire. And again, we come upon this theme where God has now bridged us past the exile, past the Medo-Persians, past the Greeks, into the Roman era. It bridges us to the Messiah, Daniel's book does, and it also assures us that God has not forsaken the Davidic covenant, but a day is still coming where the Messiah, one out of David's line, will resurface and reclaim the throne. That's what the Jews were expecting. Now, God can't very well tell them about a cappella singing and Lord's Suppers. So what he does is he uses language to which they can relate. He tells them about a new temple, tells them about a new kingdom, tells them about a new king on the throne, tells them about a list of things. All of this ideal, highly imaginative, highly stylistic, so that they know what he's doing. He's giving them the thrust of an era of hope, an era of idealism. Jim McGuigan uses a couple of different illustrations. Let me give a couple of those to you just to demonstrate how the prophets are working all of this out. Imagine a father who tells this boy, be a good lad, get good grades, succeed, get you a good job, and when you're old enough, I'll buy you a horse and buggy of your own. Well, the boy starts to grow up, and at this point, the Victorian era, the Rolls Royce becomes a little bit better than the horse and buggy. What do you know? The father ends up buying him a Rolls Royce. It'd be a graceless kid indeed who said that his father hadn't kept his promise, don't you think? That's the same thing that's going on here with God. He can't tell them about a Rolls Royce just yet. He tells them about a great horse and buggy. And when the time is right, the people knew how to relate to the horse and buggy back in their own day. But once the time came and the Messiah came, they got Jesus. They got Jesus, a spiritual leader, a spiritual king, all of that true, and incidentally enough, a lot of the physical things line up as well. Daniel predicts Christ and the kingdom that came with Christ. Now check this out in Daniel 2:44. Daniel predicts it's in the days of those kings that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. He either did or he didn't do that. Now let me point out the horns of the dilemma upon which the premillennial theory is founded. The first one is this. Either Daniel was wrong. Did Daniel say that the kingdom, the Jewish messianic kingdom, was going to come in the days of the Roman kings? If you say no, well, you're at odds with the text. If you say Daniel did say that, well, that's well and fine. But then you can't hold to premillennialism. The second option is this. Jesus was wrong. And at this point, we need to get Mark 1:15. Let me demonstrate how you've got to accept one of these conclusions if you're a premillennial fellow. This is Mark chapter 1 and verse 15. The entire Gospel of Mark opens up with this kind of line where John's in the wilderness and they're preaching the kingdom is at hand. And it says this in 1:15, Mark 1:15. The time, looks to me like that's probably an echo of Daniel 7, where he talks about the time will come, that the kingdom will be. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. This is Mark 1:15, probably echoes Daniel 7, which is parallel to Daniel 2. And it says, the time is fulfilled. Wonder what time that is. And the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. The time is the time of those kings, the days of those kings. And it's the same kind of thing that Daniel 7 talks about. Daniel 2 is the same. I don't know a scholar who disagrees with this, by the way. Daniel 2 is the same thing as Daniel 7. Daniel 2 gives us 4 sections of an image. Daniel 7 gives us beasts. Daniel 2 gives us 4 sections of an image. Daniel 7 gives us 4 beasts. Daniel 2 has a stone colliding and taking over the image. Daniel 7 gives us a son of man who takes over the 4 beasts. These are parallel prophecies. These are parallel prophecies. Now let's get the point then again. If you say that Daniel was saying that the kingdom would come in the days of the Roman kings, and the kingdom's still not here, then Daniel was wrong. Jesus says that the time was fulfilled in his day, and he said that the kingdom was at hand. If you say that the kingdom still hadn't come in Jesus' day, Jesus was wrong. Now there is a way that the premillennialists attempt to justify all of this, and they say there is what was called the postponement. The postponement. And they say this: Jesus and Daniel weren't aware that the Jews were going to reject the kingdom. Daniel and Jesus weren't aware that the Jews were going to reject Jesus bringing the kingdom. That's what it was? Well, then let's see this. It can't be postponed if Daniel initially intended. If Daniel's prophecy initially intends it to be fulfilled in Jesus, if that's what Daniel had in mind, the kingdom's going to come in the days of Jesus during the time of Rome, then a postponement theory, a postponing of Daniel, makes Jesus wrong or Daniel wrong, or perhaps both of them wrong. Do you see that? I don't know. Give my book a read if you think that's a little bit thorny. Tough to kind of make sense of if you're not real familiar with the premillennial view. They've got a mess in trying to work out the kingdom and all of that. Here's what I think. Daniel says kingdom because that's what the Jews could relate to. The Jews knew about a kingdom, and I don't mean to say anything like this is just pure metaphor either, though. Keep that in mind. The Jews knew about kingdom. They didn't understand, though, like with the Victorian era, this is the horse and the buggy, and God's telling them in their own language, new temple, new king, new throne, united empire. Some of these things aren't ever literally fulfilled again, but God can't tell them Lord's Supper. He can't tell them a cappella singing, etc., etc. You know what God tells them instead? He tells them kingdom. But what he knows is coming is the New Testament church. This is the only way to keep Daniel and Christ in their integrity and to recognize that the Jews are God's people. The Jews were God's people in the Old Testament, but they were the Jews of faith. He says kingdom. The New Testament church is God's kingdom. It's the people of faith. He says horse and buggy because that's what they understand. He doesn't tell them New Testament church. He doesn't tell them Lord's Supper. He doesn't tell them a cappella singing. He tells them what they understand, and they understand Old Testament language, Old Testament theology. He tells them horse and buggy But there's a day coming where this God's going to fulfill promises greater than they ever knew, and he gives them, the Rolls Royce. He can't tell them about this. It doesn't exist yet. To tell them about something like that is completely unrelatable to them. But to tell them this, knowing that a greater thing's coming, that's something they can relate to. Look at 2:44 again. It's in the days of the Roman kings. If we keep Daniel's integrity about him, we need to give this thought about the kingdom a second look. He says he'll set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left to another people. It's never going anywhere. Babylon's kingdom went to the Medes and the Persians. Medes and Persians went to the Greeks. Greeks went to Rome. This kingdom's not going anywhere. It's here to stay. It will crush, verse 44, and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Here's an interesting word. Let's get this back up. This is the word crush. That's what we have in our English text. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44 in the LXX has a Greek word. And that same Greek word is used not accidentally by Jesus. It's the same word, crush. But this time, it's used in Matthew 21 and verse 44. Well, let's see if we can make the connection. Daniel 2 pictures this stone that's coming, and it's going to crush all the parts of the image, and it will never be destroyed. Now, this is Matthew 21, and this is at the parable of the vineyard, where the father, he sends out his servant and his other servant and his other servant, and they keep getting killed off. So he finally decides, well, I'll send my son. And they kill the son as well. Now, catch this in 21 and verse 42 of Matthew. It says, Jesus said to them, did you never read the scriptures? He's saying to these antagonistic chief priests and Pharisees. Matthew 21:42. Did you never read the scriptures? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And he's got a couple of texts from Isaiah in view there. But he's still talking about the stone, right? Not accidentally. Christ is still talking about a stone. You get Daniel 2 is talking about a stone. Christ is talking about a stone. Here's 21:43 of Matthew. Therefore I say to you, Jesus is speaking to these wicked Jews who aren't God's people. God's real Jew was always a physical Jew, keep in mind, but it was a physical Jew of faith. The chief priests and Pharisees in this context are nothing of the sort. So he says in 21:43, I say to you, chief priests and Pharisees, the kingdom of God, the reign of God, which is within you, it's a spiritual entity. So says John 18:36. So says Luke 17:20 and 21. The kingdom of God, the reign of God, will be taken from you, the Jews, as a physical nation, and given to a people producing the fruit of it. Now catch what's going to happen. And he who falls on this stone, talking about the kingdom, will be broken to pieces. But on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. In the Greek New Testament, you have this same word. It's going to crush him, drill him into powder. It's going to crush the fellow. And Christ is not accidentally drawing on the same stone passage of Daniel 2:44. This stone will crush those who oppose it. Christ brought his kingdom. The reign of God was something that Christ brought. It was established upon his resurrection. And he said, you keep rejecting this sort of thing, and the kingdom of God has a certain justice about it, and it'll take its revenge even on the chief priests and Pharisees. It doesn't matter that they're physical Jews. Those who think that the Jewish nation are still somehow sacred in God's eyes today just because they're physical Jews are just as equally guilty of the same things in John 8:44. You see the point, John 8 rather, where they say, well, we're physical Jews, we're Abraham's seed. And Christ says that doesn't amount to a hill of beans. The real Jew may have been a physical Jew, but it was a physical Jew who was always supposed to be one of faith. And Jesus is saying it doesn't matter that you're chief priests and Pharisees, scribes, whatever. He's saying that what matters is that you're living by faith. And later on, the Gentiles even will be grafted into this kingdom. I don't see how you can read the New Testament or the Old for that matter and still think that the kingdom of God is some physical entity of Israel that's going to resurface on planet Earth for 1,000 literal years. This is just not in the text, folks. So in Daniel chapter 2, let's get back to this in verse 45. This kingdom, he says, inasmuch as you saw a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, Its interpretation is trustworthy. All of these Old Testament texts about the stone, sometimes they speak about God. The Old Testament folks didn't really have the best understanding that God's final Messiah was also going to be God in the flesh. They didn't pick up on that. Jesus had to explain all of this, and the resurrection proved it. But Psalm 110:1 said something like this: "The Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, my footstool." That's Psalm 110:1. Jesus was going to be the stone, the God of Israel, who came in the flesh. It was God. He was God in the flesh. So this is 246. He interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream after telling him what it is. The kingdom of God is coming. This can't hardly be fulfilled in the Grecian era. The writer, if he even were a late fellow, wouldn't have written this that way in a very late time. So in Daniel 2:46, it's speaking about, all of this is speaking about the coming messianic kingdom fulfilled in Jesus in the New Testament church. We can embellish that more. It's not our concern. We don't have time. Get the book, give it a read, give the text that I referenced there a read. This is 246. King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel, gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." Now catch this. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over all the province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made request of the king. He appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. Not unlike Joseph. He's a man of God, and he can't help but succeed in the Babylonian Empire. God's got plans for this fella. We're already seeing a few of those. Daniel 2 is extremely good. It is. Let me make this point as a close once more before we move forward and just bring all of this to a close. Daniel chapter 2 is equivalent to Daniel chapter 7. Here, we've got 4 sections of an image. Here, we've got 4 beasts. Here, we have a stone that casts down the image. Here, we have a son of man as opposed to a beast. This, the stone, is set over against the other elements: the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, the clay. Here, the son of man, the human-like one, as the text would literally be translated, is set over against 4 beasts. This is God's thing. This is God's thing. And God's bringing something into fruition. It culminates in the messianic kingdom. The Jews have been awaiting this. They're wondering in the exile, is the Messiah's kingdom ever going to come? And God's assuring them, we've got 4 sections. We've got 4 beasts. And in the 4th section, I'll bring it all into fruition. Daniel is assuring them God is loyal to the Davidic covenant. It is going to be a little while, but God has a plan, and he's working it out in the nation. It's just going to take some time. Maybe God has a plan for you. Maybe it's just going to take some time. Don't know what quite that is, but maybe you've got questions, concerns. Maybe you're going through some things and you need somebody to help you with that. If I could maybe be of assistance, shoot me an email, drop me a line, and I'll do my best to do what I can. My email is drewleonard@live.com, drewleonard@live.com. If you need anything from me, if I could help in any way, look, I'd be happy to assist. If you're just wanting more material, Bible material that is, maybe give a good look at the Daniel commentary. It might be a little more extensive than what I've done here. Might help you. You can get those cross references. You'll have the material. Maybe I'm going very much too quickly for you in this series. If that's the case, the book might be a little bit better. You can take your own time, or maybe you even can slow this video down on YouTube. I think they make that kind of thing possible now. There are other books on our website, cadleonard.com. Whatever we can do, we'd love to be of assistance. We're glad you're taking your time to watch these videos, and we hope that you're growing closer to God in the process.